Well, Max Verstappen is on the pole for the British Grand Prix, the 75th anniversary race for the FIA, for Formula One. A big pole to win, particularly where Max has been over the last few races with the Red Bull Honda, and particularly where he was yesterday. Although I did say in the video yesterday that Red Bull do have a habit of picking a car which appears not to be handling very well, understeer, flick oversteer, and doing a lot of good work with it. And I did also say at the end of the video yesterday that Max Verstappen was really quick on a full load of fuel at the back end of Free Practice 2, FP2, and you would ignore that little cameo at your peril. FP3 today, the Red Bull showed no signs of being a slow car. Max was not quickest at any stage, but only because it was FP3 and it was gusty and the temperatures were different and there was a lot going on. It was a big shunt for Gabriel Bortoleto as well. When he lost it in the middle of the Beckett's S's, looks as if something might have broken, because as he hit the wall, the left front suspension was already broken. Didn't appear to have hit anything solid before that, although he did have quite a hard ride over the curbs, and of course that brought the reds out. And as we went into qualifying, I think most of the bets, most of the money was on either Charles Leclerc or Oscar Piastri to get the pole. Max probably 3, P4, something like that. But let's have a look at the results first of all to see how it actually panned out at the end of this qualifying session. But Max Verstappen got the pole. Only 2 drivers under 125. One of them was Max Verstappen, 24.892. Oscar Piastri, 24.995. Yes, unbelievably close, as it always is in Formula One. But Max Verstappen slightly quicker than the faster of the 2 McLaren-Mercedes drivers around Silverstone. Amazing, really, when you think about it. We'll get on to all that, the analysis of Max's lap and the laps of the other drivers, his nearest rivals, as we go into this video. Lando Norris, P3, 25.0. George Russell, good job in cooler weather. The Mercedes tyres working a lot better, and George Russell getting a lot out of that car, 25.0. Lewis Hamilton, quicker than Charles Leclerc. Although he's not on the pole, not on the front row, he will feel very, very happy about that in front of his home crowd. Charles Leclerc just a shade slower in the other Ferrari. Disappointing qualifying for Charles Leclerc, that is for sure. And Kimi Antonelli, a bit breathless on the quick corners, as we've always been saying, but there or thereabouts. And a stellar performance too from Oliver Bearman in the Haas Ferrari. He's been looking really good this year, and he did that despite a shunt, would you believe, at the end of FP3. After the Bortoleto red, they went out again. Brakes were cold. He was coming into the pit lane, just locked the rears and went into the guardrail quite heavily on the right, going into the pit lane. And a good job by Haas, obviously, to rebuild that car. But more importantly, I think a good job by Oliver Bearman, not only to be super quick, but not to hit anything and to do it in a really polished way. So a fabulous lap by Oliver Bearman. And needless to say, I totally disagree with the steward's decision to give him a 10-place grid penalty for effectively speeding in the pit lane. Absolutely ridiculous. Many drivers have made ludicrous errors on opening laps of Grand Prix, most recently Kimi Antonelli, with the brakes not up to temperature. And here's Oliver Bearman having a 10-place grid penalty for an incident that takes place in FP3 in the pit lane. It is crazy. And it wasn't even the major part of the pit lane. It was just the entry to the pit lane, 90 degrees before they even got to the actual pit lane. Fernando Alonso dragging the Aston Martin up yet again, as you can see, 25.6. I'm sure he'll be saying that's the most we can get out of this car. He was slightly quicker in Q2, as you can see. And Pierre Gasly has been nowhere all weekend in what is obviously an incredibly difficult car to drive. The Alpine-Renault also made it through to Q3, just showing again the quality of Pierre's driving. His teammate Franco Colapinto losing it in Q1, under pressure right at the end of Q1 in the most ridiculous way, just coming out of the slow right-hander onto the pit straight at the end of the lap, got on the curb, too much throttle, too much load on the car, as he did in Brazil last year in the wet. I know there's a lot of money coming from Colapinto, the latest of which is Claro, the electronics company, the telephonics company based in South America, and that's the latest sponsor just announced for the British Grand Prix, which obviously is tied to Colapinto, but surely it is time to put Jack Doohan back in that car, because it's not good enough to see Colapinto making the same mistakes. As a rookie, you accept those mistakes, but to continue to make the same mistakes, just loading up the rear too much with too much aggressive throttle, not good enough in my opinion. Steve Nielsen joining Alpine as managing director fairly soon. Great move by Flavio Briatore to put Steve Nielsen in there. He's got a great brain, knows that team very well. Let's hope that, let's hope we see some Jack Doohan with some other changes coming at Alpine. Carlos Sainz did a good job after 3 messy practice sessions in the build-up to qualifying. Alex Albon couldn't get the tyres to work, couldn't get the thing to work in Q2 at all. And Yuki Tsunoda, as ever, very disappointing in the other Red Bull, making no progress either, a little bit like Franco Colapinto in that respect. Isaac Hadjar, 25.8, Liam Lawson, 26.4. That was right at the end of Q1. Lawson complaining that he didn't know what had happened, he had no grip at all. Well, what happened is that the variables changed, lots of variables came into play, particularly with the gusts, particularly with the changing track conditions. And as we've always been saying, Isaac Hadjar, who drives with the front of the car, gives himself a bigger sweet spot in which to operate around the variables. Liam Lawson still driving on the rear of the car in a sort of 2.0 Franco Colapinto way, but doing it with a little bit more flair, gotta say. Just couldn't cope when the variables came into play. And as we said after Austria, he's not going to find it as easy. We predicted he wasn't going to find it as easy at Silverstone, and I'm sure that's what happened. He came to Silverstone feeling ultra confident. I've got it licked. I know where I'm at, and then reality set in, and he's back where he was before Austria. And Lance Stroll, as ever, was nowhere in the other Aston Martin. Now let's get down to how Max Verstappen put that pole lap together. Quite a lot of talk about how Red Bull were not running a lot of wing compared with their opposition at Silverstone. And if you look at the speed trap times put out by the FIA, that would appear to be the case. Yuki Tsunoda was also pretty quick. But what I'm looking at is what they were actually doing on the straights, the 2 straights, the Wellington straight and then the Hangar straight, in different directions. So one was tailwind, one was headwind. And what they were actually doing on the lap on which Max got the pole. And that is what we're going to be seeing here, the actual top speed relative to what he was doing around the corners. First point to make about Max is that he went out very late in the last phase of Q3. There were certain points of qualifying when he went out first. There was a little bit of rain anticipated. But on this occasion, Mercedes went out first, and Max was last of the quick runners out there. So Red Bull, in that sense, Max thinking, yeah, I want the track at its quickest, and I'm prepared to run this right up until the last few seconds of qualifying. So that was the first call he made. Now let's have a look at what happened at various stages of the lap. I've chosen some of my favourite bits of the Silverstone lap, so I guess you could say this is a little bit self-indulgent, but to me, these together add up to the Silverstone lap. If you're doing well in all of these corners or parts of the lap, then the Silverstone lap's going to come to you. Then it's just a question on the neat and tidy, slower bits, not making any errors. So turn 3 braking, let's have a look at turn 3 braking. That is obviously they go through turn 1 very quick, turn 2 is a sweeper, then they're braking hard into turn 3, the right-hander. And I thought it'd be interesting to have a look at that at a specific point when they're all braking, but to see who's braking later, who's braking earlier, who's taking more speed out of the car, who isn't. So look at that. I've done that in the order of the highest speed going through that point. George Russell, you could argue, braking latest into that point, 159 kilometers an hour in 5th gear. Lando Norris, almost the same, also braking late in the McLaren-Mercedes, 155. You can kind of understand that. I think Oscar is a late breaker, but Lando, this was his last lap. This was going to be a pivotal lap for Lando Norris, maybe to get the pole, but certainly to out-qualify Oscar Piastri after his win in Austria and to redress the balance and to continue the momentum that he's got at McLaren. So he's going into that section, braking as late as he can. And look where Oscar Piastri is, 140 kilometers an hour in 3rd gear at that exactly the same point on their 2 quickest laps. So Oscar Piastri at this moment, I find this quite surprising, but very impressive, thinking now, I'm not going to be braking late here. I'm just going to be looking exit, just making sure I can get all the power down when I need it onto the Wellington straight. So I thought that was a really interesting comparison. Kimi Antonelli, yeah, also braking pretty late in the Mercedes, probably looking at George's telemetry at that point. Yeah, I will brake at this point. That's where George is not doing quite as well, but doing okay. Although he's panicking a bit, and he's already in 3rd gear at 148 kilometers an hour. Charles Leclerc 142 versus Lewis Hamilton 129. Look how early Lewis is braking and how relatively slow he is at that point. That doesn't mean to say he's slow for that section of road, or indeed was slow over the Silverstone lap, because he was quicker than Charles Leclerc. We should bear that in mind. But what Lewis is doing there is exactly what Oscar Piastri is doing. Now, brake early here, just get the car settled. And if anybody knows that section of road, how to drive that section of road, and the tight bit at the end of Wellington Straight, it's Lewis Hamilton. So I think he's got it absolutely right. And then look who's nearest to Lewis. If braking early there is the way to do it, look who's also doing that. 133 kilometers an hour in the Red Bull, Max Verstappen. This is arguably the fastest racing driver in the world on his pole lap, and look where he's braking going into turn 3. That in many ways says it all. Now they get onto Wellington Straight, and you can get to terminal velocity on Wellington Straight. It's a long straight. and on this occasion there was more or less a tailwind. I didn't see any toes there. Max Verstappen, yeah, he's not running a lot of wing on the Red Bull, but we can't really compare it with the Ferraris or the Mercedes or the McLarens because they're different cars. But certainly for Max, he's running as light as he can possibly get away with, because if you look at the Silverstone map, a lot of it is in a straight line. So it stands to reason if the Red Bull isn't a great car in terms of just leaning on it and being totally predictable and having massive grip front and rear, if the Red Bull isn't that car, which it isn't compared with the McLaren, then the only way for him to get any sort of lap time out of that Red Bull is to focus on the straights and to make the car as light as possible. And it's paying off here on Wellington Straight. And it's not just 1 point. Of course, if he's got this slight advantage, it's over a reasonably long period of time. Max Verstappen 3.24, Lewis Hamilton 3.21. Interesting, eh? Two of the slowest guys in terms of braking into turn 3 have got a great exit out of that slow section, and look where they are in terms of terminal velocity on the Wellington Straight. Charles Leclerc 3.20, so Lewis actually quicker than Charles Leclerc by a shade. Kimi Antonelli 3.20. George Russell, for all the bluster of braking late and being very quick there, look where he is compared with Kimi Antonelli, a little bit slower and not very quick in a straight line down the Wellington Straight. Now, he may be running slightly more wing than Kimi Antonelli. I doubt it, though. George Russell, more wing around Silverstone than Kimi Antonelli? I don't think so. Oscar Piastri, 3.19. Lando Norris, 3.18. I think that tells a story, which is that, for me, this is the first indication that McLaren, if they'd taken the Max Verstappen philosophy, would be quicker in a straight line here. And that to me suggests that McLaren are running too much wing around Silverstone. Now, how would that have happened? It would have happened because of the feedback of the two drivers. Yeah, it's a bit light here, a bit light there. Of course, what they're not getting is the feedback from a Max Verstappen who can say, yeah, I'll live with that, don't worry about it. And I think McLaren have penalised themselves by running too much wing. I don't think Max ran a ridiculously small amount of wing. I think on what we're seeing here is that relative not only to Red Bull but also to Ferrari and Mercedes, McLaren ran too much wing. Now we get to turn 9, Copse, another of my favourite corners, about which I spoke yesterday, when the track was very different. The track was slower, there was less grip, and Charles Leclerc was the only guy flat through Copse, absolutely flat in 8th gear. Today, virtually everybody was flat, except for 3 drivers. One of them was Kimi Antonelli, totally predictable, not brilliant on fast corners, still finding his feet at Mercedes. This is Silverstone, the last of the super quick circuits and dramatic fast corners. Well, I suppose we should include Spa in that as well, shouldn't we? Poor. The second one was Lewis Hamilton, who just lifts a little bit going in. Confidence lift, Lewis, that's all it is. And then the third one, Max Verstappen. Unbelievable. Now, Max had some adventures at Copse because on his out lap, his preparation lap, Kimi Antonelli was coming up behind him on his mirrors. As I say, the Mercedes went up first, and Kimi was coming up out of turn 8, and Max could see him, and Max actually gets on the brakes and pulls right over and slows right down, not to interrupt Kimi's line at all into Copse and to give him free use of Copse corner. Of course, then Kimi slows down because he does his quick lap, and now Max is on his quick lap, and he catches Kimi Antonelli at exactly the same place going into Copse, except Kimi doesn't do for Max what Max did for Kimi. He kind of stays there, and Max goes into Copse corner with Kimi Antonelli uncomfortably in front of him. Now, if Charles Leclerc went off in qualifying in Canada because of dirty air from Isaac Hadjar, I can tell you now there would have been dirty air from Kimi Antonelli's Mercedes in front of Max's car on his pole lap going through Copse. So Max Verstappen living with the dirty air from Antonelli and catching Antonelli as he's coming out of Copse. Very uncomfortable. Look at that. Nonetheless, Max Verstappen through in a specific point in the middle of Copse corner, turn 9, the fastest driver on the track. 3.09. Second, Oscar Piastri. No surprise there. The McLaren's a great car. Oscar's flat through Copse. 3.07. Charles Leclerc 3.07. Lando Norris 3.06. George Russell 3.05. Lewis Hamilton with that slight lift 3.02. Kimi Antonelli with that slight lift 3.02. But Max Verstappen also has a slight lift. I say a slight lift. Probably he's still on 95% throttle, but he gives it just a feather as he's going in, just to settle the car. Probably because he's not running at quite as much downforce as he would want to have at that specific point of the lap. But he's going to live with it, and he's got the dirty air, and he's still quickest through Copse. I think that was, if any part of Max's pole lap could be said to be, this is what gave him the pole, and this is what earned him the pole, it was that little bit of driving there. A little bit. Massive amount of driving there. Massive amount of talent there. just amazing. I mean, most drivers at that point would think, nah, dirty air, back off, and then you would hear about it after qualifying. Well, I had Antonelli. Blah, blah, blah. Not Max Verstappen. Just unbelievable, in my opinion. That was one of the best bits of driving I've seen for a long, long time. This is Copse corner, don't forget. Incredibly quick. You may say, if Oscar Piastri is going through flat and Lando's going through flat, how can there be 1 kilometre an hour difference? This is all about steering input. It's all about how you load the car, how you position the car, what you're doing at the rotation point. There is a rotation point for Copse corner. It's all about the initial transition from travelling in a straight line. All of that adds up to speed that will be scrubbed through the tyres or in other ways with the car mid-corner. And what we're seeing now is Max, even though he's got that slight lift, even though he's got the dirty air, he's absolutely perfect in the way the initial steering input, the way he comes out of the throttle slightly, and then the rotation point, and exactly the right moment he's straightening the car. Everything perfect. Turn 12 is the same thing. You could argue turn 12, turn 11, which is the first part of Beckett's, is absolutely flat. But here they're starting to play around a little bit with gears and with throttle. There's going to be some differences. Charles Leclerc, 286th in 8th gear. But at that point, he's got 80% throttle, and he's also got about 80% brake. So he's going in there, and he's left foot braking just to balance the car. Super, super quick. He's the only driver of the 7 we're looking at who was doing that. Second quickest, Lewis Hamilton. He's just going through with 80% throttle and no brake, which is probably a healthier, cleaner way to be driving the car. But he is 3 kilometers down there, but it's possibly giving him slightly more feel and slightly more structure for what is to come in the rest of the Beckett's S's. Third quickest, Lando Norris, 282 in 8th. He's half throttle, just half throttle, holding it there. As is George Russell, who's just behind him, 280. As is Max Verstappen, who's on half throttle. But notice that Max has already dropped down to 7th gear, so he's just trying to settle the car even more, and he's not looking for massive speed at that point. He's just looking for a really good square car that's going to enable him to really get the car right for the section in which he has to brake, the right-hander that follows, the slower right-hander that follows, and that's what he does. Kimi Antonelli, 272 in 7th. To his credit, he's not braking at that point. Mind you, the only one who's actually braking is as I say, is Charles Leclerc, and he's not braking to slow the car down, he's braking to balance the car. And then finally, Oscar Piastri, amazingly not quick there, 271 compared with Lando Norris, 282. So it looks as if Oscar's got some issue that's happened going into the initial part of Beckett's. Maybe he's caught a gust of wind, maybe something's happened, the car's not quite right in terms of load, and he's on half throttle, he's not braking or anything like that, but he's way down on Lando Norris, having been quick relative to Lando through Copse. And then Hangar Straight, which basically is terminal velocity again, but this time it's kind of into the headwind. They're heading almost south down Hangar Straight, but the wind was coming up from the southwest. Max Verstappen, and I think this tells the story. So Max is running, in theory, people say he wasn't running much wing, but look at that, 323 terminal velocity. George Russell, 323. Having benefited from a tow from Max on the previous lap. But Kimi Antonelli on his own, 323 as well in the Mercedes. So terminal velocity, amount of wing, Red Bull on the absolute limit of what they could run, but nonetheless about where Mercedes are in terms of top speed. Lewis Hamilton, quicker of the two Ferraris, 322, Charles Leclerc, 321, and then again, very slow. I think what the message from these top speeds is how slow the McLarens are, and how quick they could have been had they taken out a bit of wing from that car. Now, it could be McLaren no more than the rest of us, and it's going to be pouring with rain tomorrow, and they've got massive rear wing on the car, and they're going to win the Grand Prix by 3 laps. But we'll see what happens tomorrow. At the moment, you've got to say they're running too much wing. And whether or not they noticed that and took any wing out of the front of the car with front flap, which you can do in qualifying, it doesn't look as if they did. I think this looks to be the comfortable balance that the drivers wanted, but nowhere near the balance that Max Verstappen was able to live with. I think that is the big takeaway from this. So yeah, a superb lap by Max. We did see the beginnings of that at the back end of FP2 yesterday when he was so quick with fuel in the car. And Red Bull put their head down, did a lot of good work in FP3. They didn't go for headlines. But when it came to qualifying, Max stitched the lap together beautifully. And if you look at it from 30,000 feet, and there were some pictures today of Adrian looking a little bit uncomfortable, I thought, in his green Aston Martin outfit. What Red Bull did today with Max is exactly the sort of thing Red Bull used to do when Adrian knew he was there, whether it be with Sebastian Vettel or Mark Webber or Max Verstappen. Doing something like that where you really look at what is going to matter on the day in qualifying with the crosswinds and everything else, and what Max can live with and what he can't, and getting the best from Max's talent and his ability. And And they did it. They got the setup absolutely perfect. It reminded me of how Red Bull used to be so quick at Monza, when they actually weren't very quick in a straight line because of the Renault engine, and yet they were always quick because they focused on being very, very good out of the parabolica. And I think that's what we saw today. I think it wasn't just that they were quick out of slow corners and benefited from that. It's what they know their driver can do, what Max Verstappen can do into Copse. They weren't anticipating, I guess, the dirty air that he had to live with from Antonelli. But Max did live with it. He lived it in a very calm, non-chatty way. I don't think anybody even talked about it afterwards. But to me, it was absolutely mind-blowing how he did that speed through Copse corner. And just to reiterate, the top speeds you're seeing there are the exact top speeds they were doing on their fastest laps, not the top speeds they did over entire qualifying, which of course are affected by getting a tow from another car. So wow, yeah, what a lap. I think the big question tomorrow is what the Red Bull will be like with its tyre management. They're looking at 2 stops around Silverstone. It's pretty dodgy in terms of the loads that go through the tyres. 2 stops is probably the safest way to go. We've seen safety cars interrupting that sort of program in the past. So it could be that Red Bull can skate through. I suspect McLaren will have better tyre management than Red Bull in terms of a straight fight, straight race, Red Bull versus McLaren. Although Max, if he gets a good start, will be out front, being able to look after his tyres the way he wants. Just a reminder, there are very few pre-orders left now on the just released REC Porsche 956 106B chassis DNA watch. Bit of a mouthful, but this is a watch that basically commemorates the Porsche 956, one of the greatest of all long-distance sports cars. Porsche produced many, and this ad that they put out at the time in the 80s, I think, says it all, doesn't it? Absolutely wonderful. But this watch commemorates the 956 as developed by Richard Lloyd, the 106B. Nigel Stroud did a lot of work on that as well, on the chassis, strengthening the chassis, which Porsche endorsed and were 100% behind. And the watch is available in 2 colorways. One, the Canon colors of the 956, driven by Jonathan Palmer and Jan Lammers to win the 1984 Brands Hatch 1,000 kilometers, and then finished second at Le Mans with Richard Lloyd, Jonathan Palmer and James Weaver at the wheel. And also in the livery, if you like, the colour way of the Liqui Molloy car, which again engineered by Richard Lloyd, the 956, but won at Brands in 1986, driven by Manfred Winkelhock, great guy. Got on very well with Manfred, and very quick Italian Mauro Baldi. They won that race in 86. And I think it's really nice that REC have done the second colorway around that Liqui Molloy watch, and you can see it here. So pre-orders going quickly. Please refer to the details in the description below this video. Big thanks to Jetcraft, to OEM Exclusive, to Track Ninja, and of course to REC watches. Qualifying, Max Verstappen on the pole. Let's see what happens tomorrow. Thanks for watching. See you then.